On Monday, 27th of January, Netherlands Atlantic Youth, in cooperation with Students' Associations USA and Elias, organized a seminar on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Some 60 students and young professionals attended the conference that was held in the Academiegebouw of Utrecht University. A general introduction by Koen Berden, Manager Director at Ecoris, was followed by 3 panels that consisted of members and candidate members of the European Parliament, representatives from civil society, and experts on international relations.
I think it's nice to give you a bit of an independent view on the politics of TTIP before you enter into a panel discussion with the next part of the program. See, this TTIP agreement is no longer about tariffs only. Tariffs, more 20th century. This idea is about behind the border costs, and that is what I will focus on. Over the past 2 years, and this is an interesting one, US companies actually disinvested in China. They moved out rather than in, with amounts of 1.7 and 4.8 billion in 2011 and 2012, while in the same years investing 225 billion in Europe and 200 billion in Europe in 2012. If you're an Indian farmer growing corn, it ought to be GMO for the US market, and it can absolutely not be GMO for the EU market. So you have to separate fields, which is practically almost impossible, and you have to kind of try to separate these things, which means the Indian farmer has higher costs because it produces for 2 different markets. In practice, what this means is the Indian farmer will choose one or the other. EU has higher degree of labor regulation than the US. So for the first time, the trade unions in the United States support a trade agreement because they hope that TTIP will lead to the import of some of the regulations on labor laws from the EU. And there are 2 extremes. Either it goes all to the lowest level, and that means indeed integration will lead to deregulation, or you say no, the one that has the higher standard will be tough and force the other one to increase the standard to the higher one. And that's the nightmare of the big companies, because they think, oh my God, then we get all the highest standards from both as a compromise, and that's the other extreme. Now the truth, with certainty, will be somewhere in the middle.
Well, if you look at what has happened since the opening up of the single market, is that the percentage of intra-European, so the European trade within Europe, for the Netherlands has increased from a percentage of 50% to 70%, so much more focusing on the trade within Europe. And those bilateral agreements are not just beneficial for the famous things in trade about tariffs, but it's also that the non-tariff barriers should be tackled.
The Commission and Mr. Dijk and Mr. Berden have said that they are projected to be reaching up to 120 billion a year. As Mr. Berden said, this is indeed not the first nor the biggest trade negotiation. We've been doing these kind of negotiations for many, many years, and we've seen the same assumption have effects on the ground.
But my concern is really about the process. How are we getting to a deal? But secondly, which is maybe a bit more worrying, is that in the negotiations between the US and the EU, they are now also discussing about a regulatory cooperation council. I have no idea exactly how that will look like, a regulation cooperation council, but it means that before, at the EU side or the US side, policymakers are discussing new regulation, they should have, once there is a TTIP, once there is a free trade market between the US and the EU, we should be discussing first with companies whether that is a wise thing to do.
But not only am I a member of the Trade Committee, I am the spokesperson for the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe on TTIP. And so it means that I sort of breathe TTIP these days, because there's a lot of questions about what this agreement may lead to. And now we are almost a year into the process. How does the process work? The member states of the European Union give the authority to the European Commission to negotiate on their behalf. At the same time, they are going to be involved throughout the process. They have to give their consent at the end of the negotiation process, and the same goes for the European Parliament, which, since the Treaty of Lisbon, has a lot more responsibility in agreeing on international treaties, and has shown before that it is willing to use these teeth if necessary.
TTIP would be the most significant bilateral free trade area to date. Free trade between the US and the EU would have, in my view, a positive impact on world trade and income. I think China will have the chance to raise its standards and show that it can be a partner in trade and regulations with other developed economies. I judge that TTIP will force China to upgrade the structure of its economy.
Barriers are not always bad per se. Some of the barriers are there to protect our cultural preferences or our other types of preferences. And so you read trade theory and then you see trade is a win-win situation. And so everybody is in favor of trade because everybody wins. Well, this may be true at the macro level, but it's certainly not true universally. It's also not true at the micro level. So it could easily be the case that although, for instance, GDP growth or employment growth, macro, that some sectors suffer, or some regions suffer, or some individuals suffer, or some companies suffer.
I think this is going to be a really big debate. It is already on the European level. So I think it's very unlikely that after decades of lobbying against this type of legislation, against this precautionary principle, that now suddenly the US would say, okay, you know, forget about it, we'll just accept your standards. So, and we'll just be happy with the precautionary principle. No way.
Wouldn't it be, in that light, be beneficiary for the Chinese economy if TTIP would get there?
It is necessary to raise its productivity, to raise its industrial structure, to be able to cope with what Europe and the US will have as standard.
That's a very specific aspect, which is also very controversial. So it's not that everybody agrees with this. That this
Do you agree with it?
No, I don't necessarily. But you cannot just disregard a whole trade agreement on the basis of its most controversial aspect, I think.
Well, the Netherlands has been a staunch supporter of a free trade agreement with the US from the very beginning, namely that TTIP is not about containing or confronting China or any particular country in specific. It's important to stress that TTIP is not meant to be a transatlantic bastion against the rest of the world. It's about setting a positive agenda for a stronger rules-based order, which will be to the benefit of all.
In the aftermath of World War II, Europe struggled to regain its economic footing. And there were a range of different political and economic choices for countries such as the Netherlands. Economic integration was not a foregone conclusion. And we live today in prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic, thanks to the path that was chosen. TTIP negotiations are underway. There remains a lot of work to be done.
NATO, where the question again is raised, what to do, what kind of tasks should NATO do in the future. This is not a new question. This question has been there on the table ever since the beginning of the 90s. And again, and now it's an important issue again, because the end of the Afghanistan operation is coming. So a question, for instance, for NATO, what to do for the future, is actually linking to the reason why we are here today, the TTIP.
US, Europe and Japan would limit the possibilities for China to go its own way. So it's not against China, it's more a matter of take it step by step. You can also look south. As Melin already said, the TTIP is the first real transatlantic initiative in the post-Cold War, as you said, two posts. Yeah. Anyway, what you're referring to is that not much has happened for a long time, right?
And I was just wondering what y'all think is needed to increase that trust, or at least maintain the trust on a geopolitical level to make TTIP a success.
When I was reflecting on how we were talking about this today, trust is actually the center of any relationship. It's the center of trade. Buy something from someone else, or the generation that you were born into can go to the United States if you're Dutch without a visa. We can come here without a visa.
I would like to thank our four distinguished participants for their statements and their time, and also for you for listening to us. Thank you very much.